On World Talks today, we'll be with Robert Dickson Crane, former advisor to President Richard Nixon. We'll explore the contrasting elements of US presidency under Nixon and Donald Trump. You worked with President Nixon. How do you see the situation in the United States back then and the United States as we have it today, if you were to contrast it?
Those are two questions. One is, how do I see the situation? And the other is, how do I see the two presidents? Because the situation now is very similar. I prepared a journal personally for President Nixon every month, the best writings in academia about the major world problems. And he was interested in religion as much as anything else. I was his advisor on the world religions, particularly on Islam, because I told him the most powerful force in the world against communism is Islam. And nobody had ever told him that, so he wanted to know more about Islam. The most powerful force in the world against terrorism could also be Islam. The Muslims don't have it together, but it could be. So Dickson had two levels. One, grand vision. And he did have grand vision. But he was also, like most successful politicians and most successful businessmen, he was transactional. And I think, but I don't know, that President Trump is similar. When he campaigned, he emphasized that one of the big problems in the world was nation building. The concept that the United States, following the Europeans, can create artificial nations. And the only way to do that is by destroying all the existing nations, which is exactly what has been happening ever since 1920 or 18.
Now, you've mentioned that you advised President Nixon on the relations with Islam. We find that back during the Cold War era, there was a sort of a transactional relationship of the United States with Islam. Now that communism is no more and it's unlikely to rise again, do you feel Islam is viewed as the new threat?
Oh, definitely, definitely. It started after 9/11. And you know, it was interesting. I was interviewed by BBC. They were looking for somebody to interview right after 9/11. They said, why did Osama bin Laden do this? And I said, well, to begin with, we're not sure that Osama bin Laden did it. But let's assume he did. Did he do it because he hates America? Or because he's supporting Islam against Christianity? And I said, regardless of whether he did it, whoever did it, you know, assuming that it was not Americans, wanted to stabilize the world.
Do you feel the West takes a very reductionist sort of approach when it comes to dealing with Islam?
There's a difference here between President Obama and President Trump, a big difference. President Trump, to begin with, knows nothing about Islam. President Obama was a Christian, but he understood Islam. He was brought up in a Muslim atmosphere. That's an interesting story, I should tell you. Shortly after Obama became president, he flew over to Cairo, a famous speech there, where he talked about justice, the same way President Erdogan has talked about justice, and increasingly is talking about it, it seems to me. So he wrote a speech, and he mentioned justice 3 or 4 times. The speechwriters eliminated justice. I've done speech writing for President Reagan, so I know what the speechwriters can do. He wrote it 3 more times. Each time they took out the word justice. Finally, on the plane over to Cairo, they gave him the final copy of his speech. Again, they deleted justice. So he ad-libbed. He gave his talk in Cairo and mentioned justice. And he was talking about justice primarily, cooperation among the religions of the world, primarily Islam and Christianity in America. And he said, they have the same principles, the same vision, the same hopes. We can finally work together with them. Well, The incredible sequel to this is that in the next 4 years, he never once mentioned the word justice. And I think the reason is that if you're talking about justice, you're talking about change, because there's a lot of injustice in the world. If all you want to stabilize, or you maintain all the injustice in order to stabilize it, that doesn't work. Obama had the correct approach. What President Trump's approach is, I really don't know. I'm afraid that he's being brainwashed because part of his political supporters view Islam the way they used to look at communism. And as a transactional president, somebody who has to focus on the present rather than the future, I think he's listening to them, and that's a problem. When he campaigned, he was an independent thinker, and that's why he said we'll eliminate nation building, because nation building means you destroy all the nations and the artificial state that you've created. I mean, he should look at Islam as just the way Nixon did, as the greatest potential against terrorism.
Robert Crane, thank you very much indeed for talking to TRT World.